Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to your first afternoon session of the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. My name is Carlene Chamalis. I am the Collective Impact and Equity Director at the Partnership for Strong Communities. And I also have Michelle from TNP joining me in providing background support for this session. This session is entitled Pursuing Housing Justice, Intervention for Impact. And before we turn it over to our presenters, we would like to thank our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, our visionary sponsors of the Connecticut Department of Housing and Wells Fargo, our champion sponsors, Bank of America, JD, Amelia and Associate, MMT Bank, Webster Bank, and the Melville Charitable Trust. And our foundation sponsors the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, Phone Wexnick, and Trinity Financials. These sponsors' deep support has allowed the conference to happen again this year. Last but not least, a big thank you to our featured investor, Morgan Sun, for your support of the CAHC. A few housekeeping items before we get started. The session is being recorded and we will make all recordings available as soon as possible. Please remain unmute unless one of the speakers asks you to unmute yourself. And if you have any tech issues, please select the chat icon in the Zoom control panel and send it to myself, Carlene, or to Michelle. We will do our best to assist you. Your speakers will let you know how they would like to receive content questions, and post the session. You can complete a session feedback survey by clicking on the megaphone icon in the lobby. We truly appreciate your support and your feedback. And with that, I am going to pass it off to Michaela to get us started. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to give my colleague Sam a second to put up the slides. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Michaela. I am a researcher at the Urban Institute. Thanks so much for coming to this session. We're really excited for the opportunity to meet you all and share some of the work that we're doing as a part of the Urban Institute's Housing Justice Project. This project is jointly funded by the Hilton Foundation and the Trinity Wall Street. Specifically today, we are going to be showcasing a recently released digital guide called Pursuing Housing Justice, Interventions for Impact. This guide surveys existing policies and programs that we hope can help you and advocates and practitioners look to advance housing justice in your own communities. Next slide, please. As a quick roadmap for today's call, I'm going to start us off with an introduction to the project and the concept of housing justice as a whole and our housing justice framework, and how it helped us structure and inform the navigation of the guide. Then I will pass it off to my colleague, Kayla Giroid, who will walk us through the guide itself and tease out a few key example interventions that we identified according to our housing justice domains. And then I will come back again and talk about some of the additional resources coming out of the Housing Justice Project, elsewhere at Urban, and also just from the housing field to help guide thinking about how we can implement housing justice. And finally, if there's time, we'd love to have a question and answer period. And then we'll peel off into smaller presenter-led breakout groups so we can hear a little bit about you and the work you're doing. And we can hear from each other about examples of housing justice interventions that you're seeing in your own communities. So next slide, please. So before getting into the specifics of the guide itself, we thought it would be helpful to start by anchoring it to the overall vision, goals, and the underlying framework of the Housing Justice Project. So in the next slide, the Housing Justice Project launched in October 2021 with the aim to expose, elevate, and amplify a simple truth that efforts to end homelessness and housing instability will always fall short even with significant capital investments, unless we approach policy, program, and practice with an overall housing justice framework. We believe that by producing data, research, and model practices, and by providing advice and technical assistance on how to center racial equity in policy and program design, resource targeting, performance monitoring, program evaluation, then we'll see a measurable decrease in the disproportionality of race in homelessness, eviction, and other forms of housing instability, which ultimately leads to housing justice. So with that in mind, during our first year of the project, we tried to really get at what housing justice means and what housing justice means in application. So based on like an early scan of literature on housing justice, based on conversations we had with peer groups to help like pressure test and look at our definition, we arrived at this working definition that we're sharing with you, that housing justice is ensuring everyone has affordable housing that promotes health, well-being, and upward mobility by confronting historical and ongoing harms and disparities caused by structural racism and other systems of oppression. So that is the definition that we kind of came to through, again, looking at literature, but then also talking to representatives of housing authorities, peer advocates, organizations, and so they helped us kind of craft the definition that we have today. Next slide, please. In our work so far, we've identified 8 key principles of housing justice. These principles, like our working definition, were identified through a landscape scan and a literature review of like themes that we were seeing in the literature and media around housing justice. They are starting from the top and then going clockwise towards the right. Housing as a human right, primacy of lived experience, anti-racism and racial equity, social and economic equity and justice, accessibility and anti-ableism, self-determination and reparations, choice and agency, and community and well-being. I know those are very big terms. We go into them a lot more in the actual tool and also in our housing justice website if you are looking for more definitions and examples of them. If you go to the next slide, please. With kind of that framework in mind, our team has committed to bringing theory into practice and impact across 3 project goals for the overall housing justice project. First is expanding data, research, and evidence base around the need to address the intersectional nature of data research and intersectional nature of race, housing stability, and homelessness. The second is to build racial equity data and analytical tools to better understand the need and score the degree to which policies and programs are actually reducing disparities. And we're hoping to develop measurable benchmarks for making progress on racial equity at the program and at the community level. And our third goal, finally, is to influence the housing justice movement by convening people, gathering, distilling, and disseminating information about data, research and evidence, racial equity tools, and analytics. So next slide, please. Since we launched the project in 2021, we've published a number of briefs, blogs, and reports across different topics like decommodification of housing, master leasing, the relationship between histories of redlining and existing patterns of housing instability. And we have a bunch of other great literature kind of in the pipeline. And if you go to the next slide. In tandem with that, we've also created a public Zotero library with all of the resources from our initial literature review and the related reference information. So that's academic resources, policy, advocacy resources and reports, and other tools. Because housing justice is very flexible, we have an open invitation to you all, but just in general, to invite folks to email us with new additions to the library, which we try to iteratively add to, I think, every quarter. So really public invitation, if as we're talking about a concept that you know of or that your work is just released something related to, like, please feel free to email us and we'd love to add that to our library. And then next slide, please. Thank you. So over the remainder of the 3-year grant, we're hoping to shift more into convening space and designing actionable tools to advance equity and justice in the housing space, and really focus on that third project goal around distilling and disseminating findings, and essentially how can we advance housing justice. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Kayla to actually talk about the Housing Justice Interventions Guide.
Thanks, Michaela. Hi, everyone. I'm Kayla Drawd. I'm another researcher at the Urban Institute and one of the authors of the research guide, which is called Pursuing Housing Justice Interventions for Impact. This guide was written by 6 of us on the housing justice team at Urban: David Blount, Katie Elder, Samantha Fu, Jess Perez, Bill Pitkin, and myself. However, unfortunately, 3 of us couldn't join the call today, but we're excited to present our guide to you all. So we created this guide to show how communities have acknowledged the systemic harm and how, the systemic harm that housing instability has caused to marginalized populations, and how these communities have taken action to minimize and correct ongoing injustice. In highlighting actionable examples of policies and programs that align with the housing justice principles, we hope that these can serve as models for policymakers and advocates like yourselves. And so in this guide, we've organized interventions around 5 policy domains, increasing housing supply, ending and preventing homelessness, household and community protections, community power building, and opportunity and wealth. Next slide, please. So I'm going to present a bit about our methodology when creating this guide. I want to stress that we're not all necessarily experts across each of these topic areas. So we made sure to consult experts at the Urban Institute on each of the 5 domains throughout the entire process of developing this guide. First, they helped us identify specific interventions and examples of ways they've been implemented that advance housing justice according to our principles. And then we also asked them to review each domain when they were initially drafted, just to make sure that we framed each intervention and the evidence associated with it accurately. We also wanted to ensure that the examples highlighted were appropriate in terms of aligning with the housing justice principles that Michaela highlighted. One thing that we want to note is that this guide is not intended to be a comprehensive database of all the different types of policies and programs that have been implemented. Instead, it's meant to serve as more of a sampler or starting point for identifying how they can be implemented with a housing justice focus. We also want to note that these interventions have been implemented in communities with differing contexts. So we're not proposing one-size-fits-all solutions, and no one intervention can address all the complex and intersecting causes of housing injustice in our communities today. So we really only intend to highlight accessible and actionable examples of housing justice interventions that can and should be tailored based on the community. So I'm gonna show you the guide and how we hope you'll use it. Sam, you can stop sharing, thank you. Give me one moment to pull this up. Okay, can everyone see the guide?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So this is the landing page of the research guide, which provides an overview, connecting it to our housing justice framework. So in addition to highlighting each of the domains in the feature, which I highlighted in one of the previous slides, we also provide definitions of each of the housing justice principles from the framework. So that's housing as a human right, primacy of lived experience, anti-racism and racial equity, social and economic equity and justice, accessibility and anti-ableism, self-determination and reparations, choice and agency, and community well-being. Then at the bottom of the page, you can click the link to go to the next section, which is in this case, the overview of the increasing housing supply domain. However, you can also use the navigation pane on the left side, which shows each of the domains and interventions under each domain, so you can more easily find what you're interested in. So each domain begins with an overview, which discusses the issue and essentially makes the case for why we need to consider housing justice when implementing solutions. For increasing housing supply, the overview discusses the shortage of affordable housing across the nation and how it disproportionately affects people of color, making them much more likely to be housing cost burdened and experience housing instability. At the top of the page, you'll see that we've identified specific principles from our housing justice framework that each domain aligns with. In this case, it's social and economic equity and justice, choice and agency, and anti-racism and racial equity. At the bottom of each overview, we also introduce the interventions that we'll focus on for the domain. In the increasing housing supply section, that's dedicated funding sources, land use regulation, and approval reforms requiring inclusionary zoning and enforcing regional housing targets. So I'm going to jump to the ending and preventing homelessness section as an example. And this overview briefly outlines the racial inequalities in experiences of homelessness in the US, specifically highlighting the high representation of Black and Indigenous people in this population and how this inequity came about and why it persists. So the interventions highlighted in this domain are systems level racial equity analysis, housing first, emergency response resources, and master leasing. Going to housing first as an intervention. This is one of the solutions we identified for the ending and preventing homelessness domain. First, we have a general description of housing first as a philosophy and practice. And this overview describes different models for housing first programs, such as permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. However, housing first isn't a solution that is inherently implemented in anti-racist and culturally responsive ways. So further down, we show a few examples of how it has been used in practice to advance housing justice. One example is in King County, Washington, where Family Homelessness Initiative supported two Native-led community-based organizations in developing two rapid rehousing projects that provided culturally sensitive services for Indigenous people experiencing homelessness. Here it describes how Mother Nation, one of the organizations, provided trauma-informed services to families exiting rapid rehousing, including wraparound healing services for victims of gender-based violence. And I'll show one more example in the ending and preventing homelessness domain, emergency response resources. So this overview describes how emergency response resources have been distributed in forms of emergency rental assistance, emergency housing vouchers, and direct cash transfers. And one of the examples we highlight in this section is in Chicago, during the pandemic, Chicago's Department of Family and Support Services expanded their rental assistance program. However, once they assessed the rollout of the online application, they realized that they didn't have as much representation from Latinx residents in the neighborhoods most affected by the pandemic. So they shifted their approach to reduce barriers for these residents to the application by translating materials and working with trusted community partners to increase trust in this service. So as a result, they saw a 26% increase in the share of applications from Latinx residents from their priority neighborhoods. So that is all I'm going to show from the guide for today. I can stop sharing. 1 second. Okay. But yes, thank you. We encourage you to explore this guide on your own. Throughout the guide, we highlight about 50 examples of interventions in a variety of communities that could be helpful to consider for your work. So we really hope that you take a look at it. I can also drop the link in the chat for reference, and I'm going to pass it back to Michaela.
Awesome. Thank you, Kayla. As Kayla mentioned, our interventions tool has incorporated research and tools from throughout the housing field, but it is not all encompassing of all the interventions and resources that we think could be helpful to you. So we wanted to take some time to highlight other tools, guidebooks, and resources that may help you develop and implement your own interventions for housing justice in your community. Next slide, please. Awesome. So first I want to talk about local housing solutions. It was developed through a joint project with NYU Furman Center and Abbott Associates, and it serves as a one-stop shop for housing policies with actionable tools and step-by-step guidance to help cities develop, implement, and monitor local housing strategies. It provides things like guidebooks and briefs about inclusionary zoning and low-income housing tax credits. So it talks about some of the interventions we talk about in our tool, but also provides others. The results for America summaries, it provides over 50 high-level strategies and nearly 200 specific evidence-based practices and programs to overall improve economic mobility in communities, but specifically to housing, they provide an overview for over a dozen housing and community development strategies, such as providing public transportation subsidies and increasing the housing supply. And next slide, please. We also found that membership organizations representing local governments, such as the National County Association, NACO, and the National League of Cities, NLC, have also developed some really awesome tools to help develop and implement housing interventions. NACO's Housing Solutions Matchmaker tool was developed in partnership with Brookings Institute and Aspen Institute, provides county-level data on elements of the local housing market, and it identifies key challenges of each county and provides suggestions on resources on different policy solutions. NLC's Guide for Local Governments for Community Land Trusts provide backgrounds, benefits, and other mechanics of setting up a community land trust in your community, which is an intervention we talk about in our tool, but this guidebook is more specifically tailored to community land trusts. They also provide case studies and examples of community land trusts in practice, which we think could be helpful for you as you think through implementation in your own community. And then next slide. The Urban Institute, as a part of the Housing Justice Project, but also just generally as an organization, is working on resources that we think could be helpful for you all as well. We've launched the second version of the Emergency Rental Assistance Prioritization Index, we call it ERAP. It's one of our most highly trafficked tools and resources on the Housing Justice Hub. It's a composite index score that can be used to predict eviction and potential need for emergency rental assistance on the county level or on the census tract level. This tool, we think, will serve as foundational resources for those who are interested in targeting policies and resources to advance equity and long-term housing stability for households that are at risk. And as we highlighted earlier, we also have the Housing Justice Library, which is a collection of great resources that we're always adding to designed to help inform and guide a shared understanding of what housing justice is and how it's being practiced. In the next few months, we're also hoping to release a brief on community power building, one of the domains in our guide, in Los Angeles. It looks at Los Angeles as a case study and how they're using power building strategies to advance housing justice. And so we're hoping that this guide will provide researchers, policymakers, local officials, and organizers themselves. It'll provide resources for them to help implement power building strategies towards housing justice. And finally, as Kayla highlighted earlier, it's important to contextualize your interventions to your community and to the needs and the makeup and the demographic of your community. And while this is not specifically tailored to housing and housing interventions, Urban Institute has a rich community engaged resource center. It has a lot of relevant research and toolkits on how to integrate people's lived experience and community members into your work, whether that's the data side, the implementation side, the theory coming up with ideas side. Urban has a ton of great resources on community engaged work, which could be relevant and we think should be relevant when you're developing your interventions. And with that, if you go to the next slide, it seems that we have a good amount of time for questions and answers before we go off into breakout groups. So I think we can take down the slides and just kind of open it up to the room if folks have any questions about the guide, the online tool, like how we came up with housing justice, the framework, any of the interventions. I think we can take some time to just ask that around. I'm also acknowledging that Katie Elder, who is also our colleague at the Urban Institute, has joined us. She has a lot of great, she's done a lot of great work for housing justice as well. So lots of great insights from her. But yeah, open Q&A for folks.
Yeah, everyone, I'm so sorry for joining late. Had some tech issues in joining, but as Michaela said, and I'm sure she covered in like the introduction and stuff, but if there are any questions related generally to the project or about the guide in particular, before we jump into breakouts, now is the time. So welcome any feedback, comments, questions, anything like that. And if not, we can also move pretty smoothly into breakouts and hear more from you, just in sort of like a peer-to-peer sense of like what interventions you see happening in your own community. And it seems like we're a small enough group now that we could potentially just do it here, but open to what others think.
Yeah, I think this is a good enough group that we can have just like an open conversation with folks here.
Awesome. So Michaela just dropped the link to the hub, and I think this is to the, yeah, so this is the hub overall, and then I don't know if the feature was previously shared in the chat. I can also drop that in again, but if there are particular entries in particular that we had profiled within the feature that stand out to you, things that you've seen either attempted or implemented in your own communities, or things that maybe we didn't capture here, that would be worth considering under the sort of banner of housing justice, can open the floor for that.
Hi, Rachel Power from Beacon Communities. In my former life as a public official, while this isn't anything new, I had worked in a fairly progressive planning department that approached housing justice by reviewing its zoning ordinances and attempting to do a rehaul of policies that previously limited multifamily development or the creation of accessory units. So they were able to pass some new rules and local laws that allowed those by right or with limited permitting, so that we could explore more diverse options in our community.
That's great. No, thank you for sharing that, Rachel. Yeah, it's something maybe we cover a little bit in our household and community protections piece, but definitely something that we've been encouraged to explore more in terms of inclusive zoning across the board. So definitely a really good example. Michaela, I don't know if you were going to add to that.
Yeah, I was going to ask Rachel if you're willing to divulge a little bit more details there. Kind of in the creation of those policies, what sparked that change? Were you hearing from community members that are like developers that like the current zoning laws were like unsustainable or not working? Or was it something that, you know, folks coming into the elected office like wanted to change from the get-go? Just curious about like why, what kind of motivated that?
Sure. So I think it was, there were rumblings of, those changes being necessary for a few years. And this, in transparency, like this is, I'm in the Boston area, and this was a community just outside the city and within the urban core. So, there's a great need for affordable housing. It's very scarce. And so, coupled with that was the need to create diverse types of housing. And, there, at the time, we were lucky to have some support of local officials and the mayor's administration in trying to develop a policy, or multiple policies that would really open it up and make our, the community I was working in more inclusive and more affordable, and just, more adaptable to the changing urban environment, being that it was just outside Boston.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, of course.
I'd be curious, I mean, I know this is a little bit of an offshoot question, but some of my previous grad school research was around affirmatively furthering fair housing. And I know this touches on a lot of the elements covered within the guide itself, but I wonder if any of folks who are part of this group, or maybe privy to it through like community input gatherings and stuff, have been involved in some of these planning sessions around affirmatively furthering fair housing and zoning and everything in between. But I'm totally fine if not, just kind of my curiosity. But
Yeah, definitely want to like emphasize Katie's point. One of the things that we look at in the interventions guide, and one of the projects I'm working on in the Housing Justice Project is the role of like community power building and just the role of community input and primacy of lived experience in housing justice and housing interventions, and would definitely second that it would be cool to hear what folks are doing to engage communities in their housing work, if they are, or how they want to be if they're not.
I have another example. When I was working as a municipal employee, the community, being entrenched in huge public debates where, meetings were heavily attended, mostly by an affluent populace. We would get comments, disparaging, kids going into schools and so forth. So, after some discussion with the legal department and trying to promote, fair housing and, make sure that, we were, nipping discrimination in the bud. We, or our city councilors, ahead of, community meetings would issue statements, saying that, conversations needed to stay on topic, and any discussion regarding the disparaging of kids entering schools or complaints about, families and so forth, and types of families was just completely discouraged. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. I previously lived in Boston for a period, and so I do remember a little bit about this, but it's been a couple of years. So
I imagine it's probably a hot topic in a lot of metropolitan areas. With NIMBY groups, there's, similar complaints, across the board. And I feel like, everyone gets scared about schools and kids entering the schools. And it really gets discriminatory really fast in community meetings if you don't address it right up front.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't know if there are any other follow-up questions. I mean, I would love to even open it up in a broader sense around maybe what tools anyone in this group would like to see as like an actionable resource for their own community. I mean, we have the guide, which I think is a step in that direction, but it isn't quite as much like an implementation instrument in the same sense, or an equity tool. So I'm wondering if there are any either resources, tools that you've also seen, maybe similar to what Michaela covered in that additional tools section towards the tail end of the presentation, or that don't exist, and that would be something useful in the housing justice space. I know that's a very large space, but or particular to one of the domains that we cover.
I don't know if this is getting too in the weeds, but approaching like a tool, and without actually having delving into it, is there a way to create nuance so that you can adapt the tool, whether you're a developer or a nonprofit or an elected official, or whatever role you're playing in your community, so that it's something that you can practice and use in your everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a really good point. Well, if you don't have any other questions, follow-ups, comments, I think we can close out a little early. But thank you all again for being here and for your patience with me joining so absurdly late. But I'm glad that I was at least able to join the conversation for a bit. So.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks y'all for coming.
Bye.